Welcome, everyone, to the 18th year of the Honors Senior Thesis Defenses. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be part of the celebration of 9 months of hard work. At this time, I want to acknowledge the following individuals and groups that helped to keep this process going. First, I want to thank the faculty at Pulaski Academy and the administrative staff for supporting these projects and these young writers and scholars. Secondly, a special thank you to Ms. Sarah Gorman, who has been responsible for setting up the technology aspect of the thesis defenses this year, as well as helping to promote these to the larger PA community. And finally, and most importantly, I do want to thank the committee members. This year on Harper's thesis, it would be Susan Kohler, Sarah Gorman, and Cheryl Watts for helping over the last 9 months, helping Harper in the research and the writing and the editing, and they've been instrumental in the success of this project. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to Mr. Harper Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Topich, and thank you everybody for attending. Once again, I am Harper Chambers, and my thesis is on the development, presentation, and treatment of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. When talking about ASD, it's pivotal to understand and focus on education. Education is not only one of the treatments for ASD, but it's also the most effective way to destigmatize the disorder and support social integration. This thesis isn't about finding the next cause for autism. It's not about contributing to a greater academic understanding. It's about reframing a narrative and providing concise and accurate information about the development, presentation, and treatment of ASD to aid in destigmatization and education. To start this, I first looked at the foundational works related to the diagnostic, starting in 1943 with Dr. Leo Kanner. Dr. Leo Kanner was the first person to identify modern-day ASD. From there, I looked into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness to trace the evolution of the diagnostic and the changes in both diagnostic and social perception. But that's just the diagnostic. When we're looking at the presentation of the disorder, it's important to look towards the community understanding. Here, I would like to thank Hannah McGee, Anna Ledbetter, and Jesse Mitchell for being my mentors at Camp Aldersgate and showing me a side and a new group of people that I didn't have the privilege of knowing before. I would also like to thank Jeff Kopak and Amanda Jackson at Civitan Services for showing me the life of an adult with ASD, because my experience was limited to children. I would also like to thank Jesse Mitchell once again as a behavioral technician at Pediatrics Plus for showing me the importance of ABA and that these children in the end are children. I would also like to recognize Melanie Henner for showing me the importance and difference between general and special education. In regards to stigma and the interventions for stigma, I would like to recognize Diana Verity at the Arkansas Autism Research and Outreach Center for first pointing me in the direction of peer-mediated supports and interventions. There, I would like to recognize Dr. Eric Carter at Vanderbilt University, who is the pioneer and head researcher related to these intervention methods. Dr. David E. Gray in the 1990s and early 2000s was one of the head researchers related to autism stigma, and I would like to point him out as well. Now, starting with the diagnosis, to understand ASD, it's important to understand its history and its diagnostic development. Here we start in 1943 with Donald Triplett. Donald Triplett was the first person to be diagnosed with modern-day ASD. He was diagnosed by Leo Kanner, and at the time, the disorder was caused autistic disturbances of affective contact. This was first noticed by Leo Kanner when he realized that children within institutional settings that were diagnosed with feeble-mindedness and schizophrenia were not showing symptoms of mental illness. Instead, they just had different ability to learn. They were focused on sensory elements, on attainable details. They had good rote memory and organizational skills, and because of their innate focus on the physical world, they had trouble with social environments, specifically communicating their wants and needs. Although this was an amazing step in recognizing the vast difference of learning abilities and the development of ASD, Kanner's original work was narrowly focused. It only described a stereotypical case of ASD. That's why it's now referred to as Kanner's autism or classic autism. From there, we look to broader communities in the academic field, not individual researchers, but the whole American Psychological Association and their publication of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Illness. The DSM is fantastic. It serves as an authoritative guide to mental disorders and developmental disorders, and as well as mental illnesses. However, the DSM lags behind the modern understanding of ASD. This is because ASD research was first catalyzed at the turn of the most recent century. It takes a long time to republish the DSM. It requires heavy and meticulous research and debate, as well as struggling with fiscal restraints. It's hard to get enough money to republish the manual, and it's hard to get research funding for specific disorders, especially ASD. Moving on to the presentation of the disorder. Here, I will not be talking from a purely academic or purely community perspective, because the two almost live in a dichotomy or a dissonance. The academic language surrounding ASD focuses on deficits, what a child is different and struggles with. And the community perspective is focused on growth and improvement in treatment. Here, I will view novel research findings through the growth mindset of the autistic community. And this starts with understanding heterogeneity. Heterogeneity means every child with ASD presents or displays the outward manifestations of the signs and symptoms of a disorder differently. Just like every child in a typical environment is different, every child with ASD is different. Everybody has different learning abilities and struggles. The best way I can explain this is through examples. There's a child named Thomas who is diagnosed with ASD. He's nonverbal and uses his tablet to communicate. To show his wants and needs, he usually pushes things towards him or pushes them away. But this is just one presentation of ASD. There's also children like Naoki Nagashita, who published a memoir about his life with ASD when he was 13 years old, called The Reasons I Jump. He uses figurative language and imagery in his book in an enthralling way. It's very interesting to read, and if you're looking for literature regarding ASD, I would highly recommend it. Although he struggles with some sensory abnormalities, he likes to jump up and down and twirl around the room because to him, seeing the world move around him is fascinating. But he doesn't struggle with pragmatic understanding as much, although he has difficulty interpreting gestures and the hidden meanings in some words and phrases. He's a typical kid who attends a typical classroom. And this is where we get the idea of a spectrum. Not every child with ASD will require supports. Not every child with ASD will need supports. And that really expands to two different spectrums, whether you need support in regards to sensory differences or pragmatic differences and deficits in pragmatic understanding. When you're talking about heterogeneity, it's also important to note that ASD is independent from intelligence. It has no bearing on whether a child can fail or succeed in school. Sometimes ASD is accompanied by an intellectual disability, but other children with ASD are like Nagashita and published memoirs at the age of 13. Now, this idea of heterogeneity also expands into the etiology or the cause of ASD. Researchers nowadays are coming to terms with there might be multiple causes to ASD. There might be multiple different environment and genetic interactions that cause the disorder. There could be independent genetic mutations that cause ASD. It could be related to the environment or epigenetics. Insufficient time outdoors could lead to the absence of certain gut or digestive bacteria. It could also be diets high in processed food, exposure to heavy pollutants and smoke. It's also important to note prenatal development, as differences in prenatal development have increased risk for ASD. That includes low birth weights, late prenatal care, and increased paternal age. Although the etiology of ASD might be different for large subsets of the community, the pathogenesis or the development of the disorder is pretty much similar. And what I'm going to present here is not scientific fact. It's a theory. It's the best we know right now about how differences in brain structure promote differences in behavior. This is a tensor scan of the brain. A tensor scan shows the connections between neurons, or the synapses. The control individual in blue and the autistic savant, Temple Grandin, in red are shown. The theory that scientists are looking into nowadays is there's a failure of apoptosis, or cell suicide, at the end of pregnancy. Every child is born with too many neurons. And in children with ASD, that number of neurons is not reduced, or not reduced to a typical amount. Because of this excess of neurons and synapses, you have strong sensory roots and connections to the back of the brain where sensory information is housed. This causes sorting, categorizing, compartmentalizing information to be a little more difficult. And that's where we get the understanding of a deficit in sensory integration and sensory abnormalities. 96% of children with ASD report abnormalities relating to 2 or more sensory domains. The best way I can phrase this is a typical individual, like maybe you or me, we're going to experience one object through the culmination of several senses. A child with ASD, it's harder for them to compartmentalize, sort that information. It gets muddled. So they experience several sensations from one object. An example of this would be Lauren. Lauren is a child with ASD, and she has difficulties moving from one space to another, or changing her environment. This is because the more environmental changes, the more sensory changes that she sees. That might be a new taste, a new smell, a new sight, a new feeling of walking on a different type of ground, causes her brain to become somewhat overwhelmed, having difficulty sorting and analyzing that information. So she might scream or bite because she needs more support. She needs help. She needs to stay focused while she's transitioning. And that's what her parents and caregivers give her. Now, these sensory abnormalities, this focus on concrete details, this inability or difficulty compartmentalizing information, leads to pragmatic deficits. A great example of this is Greta Thunberg. For those of you who don't know, Greta Thunberg is a climate change activist. She's pushing countries to institute legislation to combat climate change and address the problem as a whole. Greta actually recognizes her disorder and credits it for allowing her and pushing her to activism. She says her focus on concrete details first pulled her towards the effects of climate change. Her difficulty compartmentalizing information made her never forget about the looming threat. Moreover, as you can see in these tweets with the United States president, she wasn't socially distracted. She wasn't scared of the social or political pushback she might receive. She stayed strong in her beliefs, and despite her opposers' titles, she knew what she believed to be right. Now, granted, this is just one presentation of pragmatic deficits or pragmatic differences. It could also be seen in language delays or the inability or difficulty with reading social cues, such as hand gestures. And to address these difficulties or these differences, we look to applied behavior analysis, or ABA. And these are methods to modify behavior, to teach a child to ask for what they need, communicate their needs and wants, and to understand the needs and wants of others. It's a chance to create socially appropriate behavior. And the foundation of ABA is laid in the functions or the motivations of behavior. Every action has a motivation. Nothing is done just to be done. So when you're looking at why someone is performing an action or doing something inappropriate, you have to ask what they want. And the 4 wants or motivations that we look towards are access, escape, stimulant, and attention. And by looking at these and redirecting it to a socially appropriate way of attaining those wants and needs, behavior technicians are able to shape, define, exterminate, and create behaviors. And it's important to focus on redirection and reward, because negative reactions could have negative consequences. An example of this would be a child named Noah. Noah is not diagnosed with ASD, but he still has some of the similar sensory abnormalities. He doesn't like dressing himself because he loves being with people. He loves getting the attention of someone else dressing him. So to help promote that independent skill, instead of staring at him or giving him negative attention for not performing a socially appropriate behavior, technicians or caregivers should walk away. Give him the chance to dress himself, and then after he performs and is redirected to perform that socially appropriate behavior, then give him the reward that he wants. Give him attention, play a game. And despite all the improvements that ABA can make, there are still widespread misconceptions and stigmas about ASD. And this stems from the lack of proper disability education. Basically, a widespread failure to learn about developmental disorders. And these are PBS cartoons. And these PBS cartoons were my first way and one of my only ways to learn about people with different abilities. The only other exposure I had was my cousin, who was diagnosed with ASD and lives in North Carolina. I saw him once or twice a year. So really, these cartoons are my only way of learning. And even here, physical disabilities are the only ones represented. When you're talking about the disability rights movement, it's really two movements. It's a movement for the rights of people with physical disabilities and the rights of people with developmental and mental disabilities. And unfortunately, the push for developmental disabilities, their rights and privileges, is far behind the other movement. And not knowing about people with differences leads to the misconceptions such as these. The autistic people are shooting up the schools. Unfortunately, this is something that I heard at PA, and it hurt me. And I can't imagine how it hurt other people who have ASD or are involved with the autistic community. This misconception of violence and psychopathy is hurtful and wrong. We also have misconceptions of apathy, but in reality, people with ASD just love and present their love in a different way. You have misconceptions that they are stupid or unable to learn, but every improvement seen throughout ABA therapy combats this. And ABA teaches those necessary skills, how to communicate so you can enter a social environment, so you can enter a general education classroom. But to treat the stigma and to have higher character independence and higher level skills, we look to peer-mediated interventions. And these were first implemented when people noticed the problems with paraprofessionals. Although paraprofessionals are great, it gives a child a one-on-one opportunity to learn from a trained professional. It gives them help changing or going to the restroom, repeating instructions, more guidance and activities. However, this physical representation of this disability presents a wall. It paints them as the other because other students don't have a paraprofessional with them. It separates them from the peers that they could be learning from. And that's why in peer-mediated interventions, a peer takes the place of the paraprofessionals. Peers are trained to repeat instructions, encourage other students to read aloud. And this has proved powerful because it has increased outcomes for both parties. The child with ASD or another developmental disability is able to receive their support and engage and become a part of more social circles so they can mimic behavior and learn from more socially difficult or complex environments and situations. The peer has also seen drastic improvements. We've noticed increases in academic achievement, in GPA, satisfaction with their social standing, and satisfaction with their school environment. And an example of this is Bradley. Bradley is a teenager with peer-mediated supports in a general education classroom. He's also diagnosed with ASD. And he was learning from his peers just as his peers were learning from him. And one day, a new classmate came into his mathematics class. He was excited because he was fantastic at math and he began flapping his hands because that's how he showed he was excited. But this new classmate didn't know Bradley. She didn't understand him and wasn't exposed to ASD before. So she began pointing at him and snickering until one of Bradley's friends looked at her and said, "That's just how he is." And that's why education is one of the most important points regarding ASD. informal education through classrooms, through mimicking behavior, is how children with ASD grow and learn. And it's how we grow and learn about them. And we have seen this in peer-mediated interventions, the importance and the growth seen in a classroom with diverse abilities, an integrated classroom. So once again, education is one of the most pivotal points regarding ASD. Thank you.
Harper, I want to compliment you about one thing that very rarely is done in thesis. You're able to integrate, a compelling narrative with scientific data, with the research. And that is difficult to do. It's a challenge for the students. If there's anyone out in the audience doing the thesis class next year, a marvelous combination of the academic, when you talk about academic and community, the bridging those together, I commend you on that. Great job on that.
Thank you.
You focus a lot on research being done in the United States. Did you come across studies in other countries as far as ASD? It seems like it's very American-centered. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes. And when we talk about the rights and privileges of different subgroups within the community, you have to understand that different countries are in different points of development. And ASD is a relatively new movement that we see in more developed countries. Because we have more professionals, especially medical professionals, that are trained and learn about developmental disorders, it's more on the forefront of our minds. We are better equipped to diagnose it. And that's why even in history, we see references to developmental disorders, including ASD. There are Irish myths of changelings that people have said might be a developmental disorder. But you can't really do anything with that unless you have the foundational supports grounded in medical professionals and teachers. So that's why we really only see it in more developed countries, specifically in the US and Western Europe.
How difficult, and this again, hopefully students out there that are taking the course down the road, how difficult your personal connection to this issue? How was that both help and a hindrance to writing this project?
I would say it was what made my thesis as well as it was. Because when I was reading, there was definitely a dissonance between what the academic community was saying and what the autistic community was saying. The academic literature focuses on deficits. It focuses on differences. It focuses on why children have trouble communicating their needs. And the autistic community, caregivers, and the people themselves are more focused on growth. And they recognize that everybody is different and everybody learns in a different way. And if I didn't have that connection to this wonderful group of people, I would not have realized that, and this wouldn't be my thesis topic. It's pivotal to understand the group you're working with or writing about.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to the committee. Ms. Gorman, do you want to start?
Sure. Great job, Harper. I'm so very proud of you. I have a question kind of looking to today and in the future. You know, we have this new normal thanks to COVID-19 that we know has significantly changed the landscapes of academic and therapeutic services. So what impacts or disruptions does our new normal have on the ASD community? And maybe what can we do to help those?
Mm-hmm. I'm not the best person to answer this question because although I work directly with children with ASD, it's in a camp environment. But in regards to the disruption that is seen in essential services, I would really say it's about reporting and getting that one-on-one assistance. So much of ABA and these peer-mediated interventions focus on mimicking behavior. And it's hard to mimic behavior and really grasp what someone else is doing if it's on a computer screen. It's also in regards to reporting. because unfortunately, people with disabilities are at a much higher likelihood of domestic abuse. And if they're not receiving support from caregivers, from organizations, that's not happening. And it's not happening because the people who report those incidences are teachers and caregivers. So if they're not having that connection, they're not getting the supports they deserve.
Agreed. Thank you.
Cheryl
Well,
Block?
Harper, I think you did an amazing job, and I hope that everyone gets an opportunity to read his thesis, because he only touched on a small bit of the data and the experience that, Harper, that you have experienced. And I've watched you with some of your friends that you have made at Aldersgate, and how you respond to them and their sensory issues, which I think is so fascinating, which I know you spent a lot of time on the paper. So I commend you. Everyone else kind of asked my questions, but I hope that everyone gets a chance to read your paper, because you really did an amazing job. And I think that you hit on something that, as educators, we really need to work with our school community to make sure that people are ready, because they're going to come in contact with students and people with ASD. They're just in the workforce. So I think you hit on some things that I hope that I can give back to the students that I come in contact with.
Thank
Good
you,
job.
Blair.
Hey, Harper, I'm so grateful that I was asked to be on your committee. Honestly, that was probably the easiest editing job I've ever had. And sometimes I had to look really hard to find something to, make a suggestion. But I think the thing that just comes through in your paper, I agree with Ms. Kohler. Everybody should read your paper. It is amazing. And your compassion and your depth of empathy, it's just woven throughout. And so, so often when I'm talking to some of the juniors about taking thesis, I said, you better pick a topic that you're compassionate about. And you certainly were. The only question I have, nothing about your paper, obviously, but I know you have had to work with some difficult situations, but was there ever a student at Camp Aldersgate that you just could not connect with?
I would say yes, but that never stopped me from reaching out. Sometimes personalities just don't meld. And at that point, you have to realize that and say, I'm not the point person to help this kid. And all my role as a counselor is minuscule to the work that behavior technicians and parents and these larger advocacy organizations do. So at some point, you just have to say, man, we don't meld so well. Maybe there is another counselor that can help this child in a better way because they have more similarities.
Thank you. This was an honor. I enjoyed every bit of it. So
Thank
proud
you.
of you.
Let's turn it over to this distinguished audience. Questions from the audience? I can't see everyone, but anyone want to chime in with a question?
Harper, fantastic job. You did everything right. You got your interviews, you had personal observations, you had peer-reviewed research. You did it all. You covered all your bases, and I'm proud of you, and I'm proud of your work. There are parts of your presentation today that, reminded me a little bit of some anthropological research, as far as, bringing in your own observations and really a comprehensive understanding. And so kudos to you. As an educator, how would you recommend that, or even as a parent, how would you recommend we merge these conversations? Because you talk about these two very distinct ways of understanding ASD. How would you recommend, us as educators moving forward to have a better understanding and to perhaps reduce some of the stigma that you mentioned earlier?
Well, everything starts with a conversation. And a lot of the social issues that we tackle in class are social issues that students are going through. And you can only bring to the table what you know and what you see. So if we're going to tackle a social issue, it first starts with getting the word out and understanding someone else's experience. And the way you do that is social integration. It is those peer mediated interventions. It is making a distinct effort to be inclusive and being happy with who you are and happy with the people around you.
Harper, I don't know. I mean, I don't expect that you're paying attention to Sesame Street nowadays, but are you aware that a couple years ago they introduced my daughter is shushing me right now. They introduced their first Muppet. I'm too loud. Julia, who is an autistic kid, and the puppeteer, her son has autism, and so that's why she's done it. So while this isn't so new to us as adults, I was proud that Sesame Street has now added their little puppet. So I do think it's getting more out there. And, everything with Sesame Street is always about wanting the viewer to feel recognized. So, and then on a random note, so Donald Triplett was actually my grandmother's cousin.
Yes, I think I was talking to Ms. Parson about that, and I thought that was a crazy connection to make. And on your point, I didn't know about Sesame Street, and that's awesome that people are starting to get this out there. But just to put things in perspective, 1 in 4 Americans have a disability, but 95% of TV and television roles are a neurotypical or person. And of that 5% that are written for people with special needs, only 2% are played by actors with a disability. And on that note, it also has to do with intersectionality, because a lot of the characters that are written are a straight, white, cis male with a disability. So it really comes to expanding this broader audience that's saying disability is non-discriminate. It's going to affect you no matter your race, no matter your socioeconomic status, and we need to start recognizing it and start promoting it in a more inclusive way.
I'd like to chime in on that, Harper. I'm assuming we probably share a lot of the same friends. I, worked at a local school for 5 years, and I think everything you said. It warms my heart to see that people are really, connecting with this population. And I know it changed your life. It changed mine. I kind of fell into that teaching role. It was not something I trained to do. I think there are a lot of issues within the non-integrated populations that could easily, as a population of neurotypicals, whatever that even means. I think we're all, we're a neurodiverse community, and I absolutely agree. Every time I taught high school, and every time I took those students out into the community, there was a very clear understanding of they belong in the community, and that they, the more the interaction that people had with them, the more excited they were to be around. They are the most fun population of people on the planet. And I think I'm so excited that you're passionate about this, because it is something that I think we can actually learn more from them than they can from us in some instances, because we take things for granted, and they're such pure-hearted in some of the things that they misunderstand. But it was like such a joy to see that that you are involved in that with them, and that you call them friends, because that, really, that makes a difference too, instead of putting them aside. So do you have plans for the future to maybe, exposing our two populations more for greater understanding? Do you have bigger plans for
I don't have big grand plans, but I know that's something I want to continue in the future. And right now I'm just chasing my opportunities. going to more community service, going to great schools that can offer me these educational opportunities. And all I know now is that I will always consider these people, this population, my friends, and that I will always be an advocate for them, because at such a young age, I was exposed and learned from them, and hopefully they learned something from me too.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I'm so very happy about that. You didn't really mention any, and maybe you went in depth in your actual paper, which I would love to read. Topich, I have a list. I need a reading list here. But the increase of diagnoses of ASD in this country specifically, like you had already talked about, it's just not as commonly recognized around the world. But when I started teaching special needs high school students, the statistic was 1 in 50 students were 1 in 50 children would potentially be diagnosed on the spectrum. 1 in 50. Did you see any current data to?
Yes, I think the most recent and widespread prevalence study cited 1 in 23, and the gender ratio was 4 boys to 1 girl.
Yep.
And I truly believe that the increase in prevalence is partly due to increase in acknowledgement and knowing that this is a thing. But unfortunately, it's also because of misdiagnosis. ASD has kind of become a catch-all syndrome for people who express developmental disorders. And that's because of funding. So much of funding for developmental disorders is funneled through the direct ASD diagnosis. So because of that, people with other developmental disabilities are searching for this diagnosis to receive essential services. So one of the things we need to do to provide more individualized supports and recognize people with different learning abilities, both typical ASD and otherwise, is make sure that we recognize that and diversify where our funding is going.
Yes.
All right. I think we'll close it up. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope to see you at 3 o'clock. Great job, Harper. Thank you again.
Great job, Harper.
Thank you.
Good job, Harper.